It's a pleasure to be here at the European Union Studies Center. In the past, I have heard a number of presentations by your former director, Professor Kaufman, and it is my pleasure to be able to reciprocate this evening. My topic is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership that has recently been proposed and is in the process of being negotiated. And what I propose to do is address the topic with 5 principal points. First, this agreement represents the continuation of a long-established and very important and extensive economic relationship between the United States and Europe. Second, in contrast, it also represents a significant change in the form of the relationship. Third, if we envisage what it will look like, it is very likely to be modeled on some recent preferential trade agreements that the United States and the European Union have entered into. Fourth, the main issues for negotiations, the critical issues, are likely to focus on behind-the-border regulatory issues. And fifth and finally, if accomplished, the agreement would bring significant economic benefits to both partners. So I begin the continuation of a long established and important and extensive economic relationship. And I go back more than 70 years in history. The Atlantic Charter, the declaration that was issued by President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill in August of 1941 after their meeting to set the goals for the post-war world that they hoped to achieve after the end of World War II. And it included an economic pillar. The countries said that they will endeavor to further the enjoyment by all states of access on equal terms to the trade and to the raw materials of the world which are needed for their economic prosperity. And then the Atlantic Charter then became the foundation for wartime negotiations and immediate post-war negotiations, leading to the establishment of the post-war, post-1945 international economic regime as we know it, notably including the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade that later became the World Trade Organization. And then if we continue to go back in history, it was just over 50 years ago that President Kennedy gave a famous address in Germany. Well, he gave several famous addresses. Of course, one was his address about Ich bin ein Berliner. But the day before that, he also gave an address in Frankfurt about noting that the nations, the United States and the nations of Europe, are working together to build the Atlantic community. And he said, in this Atlantic community, economic unity is imperative not only among the nations of Europe, but also across the wide Atlantic. And really what President Kennedy was urging was that the nations, the key nations in Europe that comprised what was then the European Economic Community, should work with the United States for joint leadership of the global multilateral trading system, again embodied in the GATT and the World Trade Organization. And I think President Kennedy's call very much came to fruition because traditionally in the GATT negotiations, it was the United States and the European communities that came together, and once they reached agreement on the principal issues between them, essentially that was the core of the agreement that was then embodied by all of the negotiating partners at the multilateral level. And the result of this is an extremely important and extensive economic relationship. Nowadays, the United States is the most important trade partner for the European Union, measured by exports. Approximately 17% of EU exports were destined for the United States market in 2011. And similarly, the United States was the third most important source of imports into the European Union. That represented 11% of total imports after China and Russia. for the United States. In 2011, the European Union was the second most important destination for U.S. exports, representing approximately 19% of U.S. exports. Then in 2012, the pattern shifted slightly, and the European Union became the largest market for U.S. exports. In other words, the European Union passed Canada, and in 2012 represented 21% of U.S. exports. Then I was, in terms of investment, the stock of U.S. foreign direct investment in the European Union now is more than $2 trillion. It represents approximately 1/2 of total U.S. foreign direct investment. European Union direct investment in the United States represents almost $1.6 trillion and represents more than 60% of the European Union's outward foreign direct investment. And as I was preparing this talk, I read a statistic that astonished me. At first I thought it was a typographical error, but I reconfirmed that it is correct. The trade in terms of goods and services traded between the European Union and the United States every day is approximately $2.7 billion. And so that level of economic integration illustrates the existing importance and economic significance of the transatlantic relationship. My second point. Although building on this strong relationship, the proposed Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP, it represents a significant change in the form of the relationship. And the change is that traditionally, or up to now, the relationship has been based on multilateral institutions, particularly the World Trade Organization, whereas the TTIP is what is known by economists as a preferential trade agreement, or sometimes a free trade agreement, meaning that it is an agreement that involves a group of 2 or more countries or customs territories in which the customs duties and other border restrictions on trade are eliminated on substantially all the trade between the members of the agreement relating to goods that originate in the 2 members. Maybe to present that in a more colloquial way, this is an agreement that is limited to trade between the European Union and the United States for goods originating in either of the 2 countries. It represents a departure and an exception from the traditional World Trade Organization principle of that most favored nation treatment, or providing a level playing field for all countries. This is a preferential agreement that will only provide benefits between the 2 countries. But the concept of preferential trade agreements is an established exception within the World Trade Organization. There is a provision in Article 24 of the GATT that authorizes these agreements. And in recent years, both the United States and the European Union have actually entered into a number of preferential agreements. The European Union has a long history of them. In fact, of course, the European Union itself started out as a customs union, so it qualified as a preferential agreement itself when it was created. Since then, the European Union is now a party to more than 30 preferential trade agreements, ranging from customs unions with a few countries, including Turkey, to free trade agreements with quite a number of countries, as well as other trade agreements with additional countries. The United States is somewhat of a more recent participant in preferential trade agreements. Up until 2001, we had preferential agreements with only 4 countries, that being the NAFTA countries, Canada and Mexico, and also with Israel. And then in 2000 with Jordan also in the Middle East. Since then, under the Bush administration, the United States negotiated and completed quite a number of additional preferential agreements. Between 2004 and 2008, we negotiated 11 preferential agreements with 16 countries, including, for example, the agreement with Singapore, with Australia, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, and others, including a relatively recent one approved in 2011, the United States and Korea. And so with this background of both Europe and the United States now comfortable with preferential agreements, the decision was made to go forward with exploring preferential agreement between the United States and Europe for several reasons. First, although the preferential or the preferred method or forum for proceeding with trade negotiations would still be the World Trade Organization, the Doha round negotiations have been stalled and delayed for more than a decade. And so given the deadlock, there is continuing political and economic support for trade liberalization. And if the multilateral forum for negotiations is not going to work, that pressure is directed in a different direction, namely in bilateral or regional and other preferential agreements. And then the immediate economic impetus comes principally from Europe, and that is the aftermath of the global financial crisis and then the resulting European financial and fiscal crisis. Germany, of course, had grown out of its own economic difficulties at the early part of the 21st century, largely by exporting, especially to Southern Europe. And with the fiscal and financial crisis in Southern Europe, that market for German exports has diminished. And at the same time, the prospect of export-led growth from the countries that have the most serious fiscal crisis in Europe also represents a valuable prospect. And so there was strong sentiment in Europe that perhaps negotiating a free trade agreement with the United States would be a valuable source of solution to its economic difficulties. The process was that after some initial discussions, every year there is United States and EU summit meeting on different issues. And at the summit meeting at the end of 2011, the decision was made to proceed forward with exploratory talks about a transatlantic free trade agreement. And so an EU-US high-level working group on jobs and growth conducted negotiations during, or I shouldn't say call them negotiations, conducted pre-negotiation discussions during the year 2000, and came out with conclusions in late 2012 and early 2013 in favor of proceeding forward with negotiations. The report of the working group said that the high-level working group has reached the conclusion that a comprehensive agreement that addresses a broad range of bilateral trade and investment issues, including regulatory issues, and agreement that contributes to the development of global rules, would provide the most significant mutual benefits for the various options that we have considered. We therefore recommend to leaders of each side that they initiate the processes necessary to launch negotiations on a comprehensive trade and investment agreement. That recommendation was adopted. President Obama announced in his State of the Union address in February of this year that the United States would proceed forward. The European Union took the same steps, and the formal negotiations began, at least the first round of negotiations was held last July 2013 in the United States. The next round of negotiations was supposed to have been held the week before last in Europe, but it needed to be postponed because of the government shutdown in the United States, which prevented the U.S. negotiators from traveling. And so, but it is nevertheless anticipated that the second round of negotiations will be held in the immediate future, and so the talks will proceed forward. So now let me turn to my third point, which is that the trade and investment partnership can be expected to be modeled on recent preferential trade agreements that the United States and Europe have entered into. And in particular, it is noteworthy that both the United States and Europe recently completed free trade agreements with South Korea. And so it is particularly the South Korean model that is likely to be what they adhere to. So let me first perhaps give a summary of some of the recommendations of the high-level working group. They indicated that the comprehensive agreement that they have in mind would include ambitious reciprocal market opening in goods, services, and investment, and would address the challenges and opportunities of modernizing trade rules and enhancing the compatibility of regulatory regimes. Specifically, negotiations on a comprehensive trade and investment agreement should aim to achieve ambitious outcomes in three broad areas: market access, regulatory issues and non-tariff barriers, and rules, principles, and new models of cooperation to address shared global trade challenges and opportunities. Within that framework, let me offer a summary of the recent free trade agreement between the United States and Korea to give you an outline and an overview of the types of topics and subjects that are included in these agreements. The first category, trade in goods. And the most important provision relating to trade in goods is increased market access. It is the staged or gradual elimination of import duties on substantially all products originating in the two parties. In addition, the agreement would reaffirm the principle of national treatment, the idea that once imported goods enter the domestic commerce of the other party, they are treated, they receive equal treatment with domestic goods. National treatment is part of the World Trade Organization rules, but it is typically reinforced in these bilateral agreements. Then there are often special agreements or special provisions for trade in particular goods or particular products that require special treatment or are sensitive between the two parties. So in the case of the agreement with Korea, these involved agriculture, textile products, and pharmaceuticals and medical devices. Then there are highly technical provisions about customs formalities, including the rules of origin that define which products originate in the parties to the agreement as opposed to which products do not, procedures for certifying the origin, procedures on customs administration, and on the facilitation of trade. Another separate important category relating to trade in goods involves product standards or behind the border regulatory issues, and I'll discuss those in more detail. Well, perhaps I should at least outline what they are about. In trade terminology, there are two categories of these. One of them is what is called sanitary and phytosanitary measures, and in normal plain language, those are principally regulatory issues about food safety and disease-carrying agents and things like that. And then the second category of product standard issues are what are called technical barriers to trade, which essentially covers all product standards except for the food safety standards. A Further subheading under trade in goods involves trade remedies in case there is an unforeseen increase in imports from either party. There are special safeguard procedures that allow temporary import restrictions to permit better adjustment to the increased trade. And there are provisions allowing the continued enforcement of trade remedies such as the anti-dumping and countervailing duty laws. So that would be the typical categories of topics for agreement on trade in goods. Second broad part of the free trade agreement with Korea was provisions on investment. And that included the right of establishment of new investments by multinational corporations, provisions protecting against expropriation or nationalization without compensation, provisions requiring due process of law in regulatory matters affecting multinational corporations, and a procedure for the arbitration of investment disputes between the multinational corporation and the host country. A third broad heading in the trade agreement involves trade in services, and it, again, somewhat like trade in goods, is subdivided into a general category that provides general rules about the liberalization of trade in services, and then special provisions for specific industries, such as in the case of the Korean agreement, financial services and banking, telecommunications, and electronic commerce. A fourth heading in the agreement involves competition-related matters, in other words, cooperation on antitrust issues. A fifth heading involves government procurement. A sixth heading involves intellectual property. And a seventh heading involves labor standards and environmental standards. And then there are additional institutional arrangements and boilerplate that finish up the agreement. So that is the broad outline of the type of topics that would be covered, and one would anticipate that similar general outline is what would be covered in the Transatlantic Agreement. So now let me turn to my fourth heading, the most difficult issues, likely to involve behind-the-border regulatory issues. First, we can observe that the traditional types of trade barriers, tariffs or import duties at the border, or other restrictions on trade applied at the border, basically nearly all of those have been eliminated through the agreements in the World Trade Organization. So the conventional border trade measures in trade between Europe and the United States are fairly low. There are some exceptions, but I think the U.S. import duties average around maybe 2 or 3%, European import duties 3 or 4%. So not really a significant issue, but even eliminating that relatively low amount of duty would be beneficial to business and to trade. The critical issues involve regulatory issues, and specifically what I mentioned in terms of the food safety standards and other product standards. One can imagine or discuss in theory various approaches to eliminating or reducing trade barriers on regulatory matters. The first is the simplest, but accomplishes the least, and that is what I've mentioned, national treatment. The idea that once imported goods enter the domestic commerce, they are entitled to exactly the same treatment as domestically manufactured goods. It eliminates the possibility that regulatory standards will discriminate against imported products. Second level of reducing trade barriers would involve establishing some sort of international minimum standard. And that is basically what is done in the World Trade Organization. In the World Trade Organization on the food safety standards, there is a requirement that the standards have to be based on scientific evidence and a risk analysis taking into account the costs and benefits of the particular product. Now, again, that is what has been achieved through the World Trade Organization. How can the Transatlantic Agreement go farther? Well, through what is called deeper integration. And there are essentially three ways that this could be done. First, simply there could be much greater level of consultation and dialogue between the corresponding agencies in Europe and the United States, so that at the minimum, the two agencies and the communities understand what is going on, and to the extent they are able to communicate and consult and collaborate, that may improve regulatory environment. A second option would involve convergence toward a common standard, if not harmonization. So that would make the product standards the same in the two countries. And then a third option is what is called mutual recognition. Each country would agree that if a product is approved in Europe, we will automatically accept their approval in the United States, and vice versa. Now, if we move beyond the general concept to the specific issues, the gentleman with the question in the back certainly hit on the critical one, which is relates to food safety standards and other standards in the category of the sanitary and phytosanitary measures. Because the European Union has adopted the so-called precautionary principle, which is basically a principle that says unless you can establish that the food product is safe, is not going to be approved. The United States has adopted a model that, again, bases the decision on scientific standards and on risk analysis, and basically says if there is substantial evidence that the product is equivalent to something that is generally recognized as safe, then it is going to be approved.
And the GMO is...
Right, and the, again, you must have gotten a copy of my outline because the two particular areas of disagreement one relates to beef that's been treated with hormones, and although that is approved in the United States but not approved in Europe. And then for various food products that have are genetically modified or have genetically modified ingredients, those have been extensively approved in the United States. In Europe, a small number of genetically modified organisms have been approved, and the approval process proceeds much more slowly. And so I would say of all of the issues, it is the manner of addressing this difference on food safety standards that could well be the critical issue in the negotiations. What the high-level working group has said is that the parties should try to negotiate an ambitious SPS plus chapter, and then that means an improvement on the World Trade Organization's agreement that establishes an ongoing mechanism for the improved dialogue and cooperation on addressing bilateral food safety standards. The standards will build on the key principles of the World Trade Organization rules, including the requirement that each side's food safety measures be based on science and on international standards or scientific risk assessments, applied only to the extent necessary to protect human, animal, or plant life or health, and developed in a transparent manner and without undue delay. Now that is a very broad and general statement, so we will see how that proceeds forward. A second issue that is essentially akin to product standards could involve environmental standards. And currently there is a dispute between the United States and Europe about airplane emission standards. The European Union requires airplanes flying into Europe to purchase carbon exchange credits, and the U.S. airline industry does not like that, and so that is a second critical issue. Then a third issue is not, strictly speaking, in the regulatory issue or regulatory area, but it involves intellectual property. And here there is a significant difference between the United States and Europe on the area of intellectual property known as geographic indications. That is the protection of intellectual property for designations that relate to the name of a location where the product is made. So the most famous is champagne, but it applies to virtually every other category of wine. It applies to cheese, applies to numerous types of ham, and so on. The European Union has an extensive system of protection of geographic indications. The United States, with very few exceptions, does not have a comparable system. We protect geographic indications to the extent they are covered by trademarks, but otherwise do not. And so that could be a critical issue, except I kind of deduce from the high-level working group's report that they may have decided that they will agree to disagree about that, because the working group report says that both sides should explore opportunities to address a limited number of significant intellectual property right issues of interest to both sides, without prejudice to the outcome. And so that is not very ambitious, and so possibly they will simply sidestep that issue. So those are likely to be the critical issues involved. Fortunately, many of the other issues that were critical in other free trade agreement negotiations are not going to be critical. A significant issue in both the European and the U.S. agreements with Korea was that Korea demanded that rice be excluded from the trade liberalization. I don't think rice is going to be an issue between the United States and Europe. Traditionally, the United States has been concerned about, basically about satisfying the concerns of organized labor and many members of the Democratic Party that trade agreements will facilitate the deindustrialization of the United States and the decline of manufacturing jobs to the benefit of manufacturing in low-wage countries. And so I don't think labor standards are going to be an issue either, because the European Union has at least as high labor standards as the United States. So those are my observations on the critical issues and the less significant issues that are likely to be addressed in negotiations, and brings me to my fifth point. The agreement is likely to bring significant economic benefits to both parties. The European Union, in fact, commissioned a study by an independent economic consulting organization to try to estimate the benefits of the agreement. And the consulting group came up with two scenarios. What was called a less ambitious scenario and a more ambitious scenario. The less ambitious scenario involved eliminating 98% of import duties, 10% of non-tariff barriers on goods and services, and 25% of barriers relating to procurement. Under the more ambitious scenario, they would eliminate 100% of import duties, 25% of non-tariff barriers on goods and services, and 50% of non-tariff barriers on procurement. And the results of these forecasts were that under the less ambitious scenario, European exports to the United States would increase by 16%, in other words, approximately $140 billion. Under the more ambitious scenario, European exports to the United States would increase by 28%, or $240 billion. U.S. exports to Europe would increase by 23%, or approximately $130 billion under the less ambitious scenario. Under the more ambitious scenario, they would increase by 36% to more than $200 billion. In addition to the bilateral trade, they estimated that one of the results of convergence or harmonizing product standards is that other countries in the world would adopt the same standards, so there would be spillover benefits allowing both Europe and the United States to export to third countries, and that would provide additional trade gains for both the United States and Europe. Ultimately, the group estimated that under the less ambitious scenario, Europe's gross national product would increase by $90 billion, the U.S. gross national product by $65 billion. Under the more ambitious scenario, Europe's gross national product would increase by $150 billion, and the U.S. gross national product by $120 billion. Now, in percentage terms, it's actually not that great. For the Europe, it would be between 0.4 and 0.5% of gross national product. For the United States, it would be between 0.2 and 0.3%. But in a world where countries are satisfied with 3% growth annually in the gross national product, the incremental increase in gross national product from the free trade agreement is not negligible and certainly shouldn't be discounted. And so those are my observations on the prospects for the free trade agreement. Again, it is something that builds on a long-established and very important and extensive economic relationship, but represents a significant change in that it is now a preferential agreement. It's likely to be modeled on recent agreements such as the agreement with Korea. The most difficult issues will be the food safety standards and other behind-the-border regulatory issues, but if accomplished, it will provide not insignificant economic benefits. And just to close, if I can come back to the speech by President Kennedy I mentioned that he gave in 1963. I reread that, and that actually reminds me a little bit of where we stand. He said, a great economic challenge is the coming round of trade negotiations. That those deliberations are much more important than a technical discussion of trade and commerce. They are an opportunity to build common industrial and agricultural policies across the Atlantic. They are an opportunity to open up new sources of demand, to give new impetus to growth, and make more jobs and prosperity for our expanding populations. These negotiations are a test of our unity. While each nation must naturally look out for its own interests, each nation must also look out for the common interest, the need for greater markets on both sides of the Atlantic, and the need to stimulate the Atlantic economy to higher levels of production. Trade expansion will help us all. The experience of the common market shows an increased rise in business activity and general prosperity, resulting for all participants in such agreements, with no member profiting at the expense of another. As they say on my own Cape Cod, a rising tide lifts all the boats, and a partnership, by definition, serves both partners without domination or unfair advantage. So let us be partners in prosperity. The European Union is sensitive to it and has made statements saying that certainly there's not going to be a flood of U.S. movies and television programs, and they are not going to dominate the networks. At the same time, they point out that there are already a number of U.S. movies and television shows shown in Europe, so they are attempting to sort of minimize the concern, and I think there would probably be limited agreement on increasing the circulation of movies and television programs, but probably they would endeavor to find ways to certainly continue to allow France and other European countries to support their own cultural industries. We have, existing transatlantic political and military structures, NATO, and so on. And so and certainly the pattern of U.S. One of the things that distinguishes preferential trade agreements from the World Trade Organization is that there is no real international or institutional framework created, no international bureaucracy created. It's simply a state-to-state agreement. And so given the scope of what has been proposed, first, I'm pretty sure it would be limited to the types of economic issues I have discussed, and second, wouldn't involve an institutional step toward some sort of, what's the word, the supranational authority of any kind. French minister's remarks are undoubtedly addressed to his domestic constituency, and so I don't think that they, I don't think that they are a clear guide to what the position will be. If an agreement that is acceptable to the European Union, to the Commission, is reached, then, I mean, yeah, in theory, any country could veto it. Countries within Europe voted against various other treaties within Europe. And so we can't really say what, from this perspective, what the ultimate outcome would be. For the bilateral trade balance, I don't think it's all that significant from a macroeconomic point of view. The United States we have an overall trade deficit. It's because our consumption exceeds, and consumption and investment opportunities exceed our savings, and so inevitably we're going to have a trade deficit with the rest of the world. The issue is, it's not from an economic point of view all that significant which countries it is with, and unless our domestic macroeconomic prospects change or our pattern of consumption and savings change, we're still going to have a trade deficit. In any event, the economic forecast from the European Union's the consulting firm that they retained showed that on an aggregate basis, the United States would end up increasing exports, global exports, more than the European Union would. And so, if anything, this agreement might reduce the aggregate U.S. trade deficit. Well, to some extent, warranties are, it is a contractual matter by the manufacturer, and so and then to the extent warranties are regulated, that hasn't been mentioned as an issue that I have seen that is on the forefront of negotiations. So certainly one possibility would simply be that they would not address that and leave existing differences in regulations pertaining to warranties in place. And so, and not having seen that issue as something that's been mentioned, I think that might be the result. And furthermore, the other side of product liability, of course, in the United States, extensive product liability litigation, and I think there would be tremendous resistance in the United States if there was a proposal to reform that, and so I anticipate that is another issue that would be left out of the agreement. I think my impression is that the greater impetus for this is coming from Europe, and I think for the reasons I mentioned, they would like to increase the opportunities for export-led growth to assist in recovery from the recession, which has been much more serious in Europe than in the United States. Well, I certainly, within business circles, businessmen are always interested in increasing their access to new markets, and and again, what were my figures? Projected U.S. exports to Europe of between 130 and $200 billion. That's a lot of money. And so it's understandable why the U.S. business community might be interested as well. I think you had also raised a question, how long is this going to take? What is the timing? I would say if it's not finished by 2015, it's going to be put on the back burner. Either it will facilitate it or it will not have any effect. It should not make it more difficult. The reason it might facilitate it is that, particularly in relation to adopting new rules or approaches to product regulation, the thinking is the United States and Europe, if they can reach an agreement on something, as a practical matter, that will become the standard for the world, and so it can simply be absorbed into the World Trade Organization, and so it would facilitate that. Also, I didn't mention agriculture, but probably the agreement would include provisions on agricultural subsidies, and that could readily be absorbed into the WTO as well, as long as either if developing countries think that the solution on subsidies is better than the existing situation, it could be easy to adopt. If they think it's not good enough, then it wouldn't help the WTO. But in any case, I'm sure that the outcome on agricultural subsidies will be an improvement from the trade perspective, from the status quo, and so that's I couldn't imagine that it could make a Doha agreement more difficult than it currently is. And I guess I should also mention the current thinking on Doha is there might be a possibility of a very limited agreement, especially addressing trade facilitation, that could be accomplished, well, the people who have their fingers crossed say possibly by this year, next year.